Hey everyone, this is Max and Max CTCG. Thank you for joining me in another video. So in this video, we're going over the Fire King Structure Deck series, and we're covering the deck analysis section. So in the last video, we covered the deck basics, where we more covered the individual cards, how the different engines work, thinking about them more from understanding the cards themselves. So when you get to the deck analysis, you actually know how the cards work. And if you understand those cards, you probably skip to this section. So what we're going to do in this video is go through all the different decks, explain the kind of structure and like thought process behind the deck, how the different engines work in terms of like the deck structure, and then we'll jump more into the combo video in the next section. So to get started, we're going to go over the structure deck version, and we'll go through each of the individual versions, and they'll also have their own individual videos at some point too. So for the structure deck version, this is going to be kind of your starting point if you just bought 3 of the structure deck, and how I'd go about building the deck. There can be, I think, some minor changes and differences for how you want to build it, but this would be like, I think, a good baseline starting point. And the truth of the matter is, it's a solid deck with a solid engine, but only playing with the structure deck is going to put you at a pretty big disadvantage. And there are some ways you can even upgrade the deck with a pretty cheap budget that will make the deck significantly better. So what I'll do is we'll go over the structure deck version, and I will show a slightly upgraded version if you want to just put a little bit of extra money into it without switching to incorporating other engines to help supplement the deck as well. So one thing to understand is card rolls in the game. Now, if you are a competitive player, I'm going to timestamp this so you could skip this section if you feel like you have a good understanding of this. But if you are newer to the game, this is a really important thing to understand with deck building and how cards work and how to think about cards. So card rolls refers to actually the role the card takes in the deck versus the type of card it is. So in older school Yu-Gi-Oh, you'd more just want to balance of monster spells and trap cards, so that way you'd open decent hands and the game was a lot slower and kind of more resource advantage, kind of beat down type of strategy. Where now with the game being a lot more combo focused, even in decks that aren't considered a combo deck, most decks are still performing combos that require multiple cards or go through multiple cards. So now we want to think of the cards more in terms of the roles they function in versus the types. So an example of a card role is a starter card. This is going to be a card you want to open with that can start your plays. This doesn't need to be what some people are going to just call like a 1-card combo. That would be like an individual card that starts your plays. There's other ways to also look at starter cards. These can also be consistency cards, something that will let you draw more cards or try to search for cards, something that doesn't necessarily start the play or even get you to the most specific cards you need, but something that can get you other cards that you'll generally start your turn with. These are really important in the modern game because you want to have a very high level of consistency, and most decks are going to try to run from usually 11 to 13 starters, sometimes a little bit more, a little less, sometimes 15. But generally speaking, that's going to be kind of the range of what you're going to be looking for when it comes to consistency. Now, some decks are more of a 2-card combo deck, require multiple cards to work together, and they don't have access to as many 1-card plays. So the consistency will be a little different, but you still kind of want to range for those percentages that you're going to be looking for when it comes to how many ways do my 2-card hands work so I can play consistently. So a couple numbers to keep in mind when it comes to thinking about what these starters mean is that if you have 11 starters in your deck, you have about an 82% chance to open up with one of them. If you have 13, you have an 86% chance to open up with one of them, at least when playing a 40-card deck. Now, depending on the number of cards in your deck, it may change the way you want to alter your kind of card roll numbers so that way they line up better. A 60-card deck has the benefit of drawing into maybe less specific cards that you don't want, so you have a lower chance of opening them. But then you also have to change the amount of starters you're using to kind of match those percentages. So it's a lot more about the percentages than it is the specific numbers. So starters are very important for getting your plays going. The next cards that you'd want to consider are extenders. Now this kind of changes based off starters, and a lot of times certain starter cards can also be extenders. Those are a lot of times called like superior starter cards because they do both. And extenders can kind of be broken down into two categories. You have, your superior extenders and additional extenders. Now, superior extender is similar to a starter card where it doesn't need another card to work. A lot of times the cards that will be a extender and a starter are cards that can play through another card. So that's really what extenders allow you to do, is keep extending as your opponent tries to stop you. So an expensive card out right now that would count as a superior starter and extender is Wanted. And this is used in the Sinful Spoils version of the deck. Is very popular right now, and it'll get even more popular post Phantom Nightmare. So this card lets you get to another card that lets you keep extending. Now this could start your play, or you could use this to follow up if your initial play gets stopped. So these types of cards are very valuable because they serve two different roles. Now additional extenders are also still solid, but the difference with these, a card like Kieran, they need another card on the field to be able to work. So they need to combine with generally a starter card to be able to be playable. So a Ponyx and a Kieran is a really good extender because Kieran will let you one, avoid maybe an infinite impermanence or effect failure trying to negate your Ponyx, which is starting your play, while also getting itself onto field as another body to use. So it serves two roles as a way of countering your opponent's card, as well as extending to another monster that you can actually summon. So there's different starters and extenders, and some will be better than others, and it's kind of finding a balance of these two. Sometimes a number to consider is like 12 to 14. But it does kind of depend on how many of those are overlapping between your superior extenders that are starters and extenders and just additional extenders. Another thing to consider are cards that are better for going second. So we have here our kind of board breakers or hand trap cards. These are cards that are meant to stop your opponent, and they kind of function differently. So a hand trap is focused more on stopping your opponent from being able to get to their play that they want to be able to succeed at, and either it will completely stop their board and they really will end on nothing, and then their only defense will probably be hand traps to stop you, or it's going to be board breakers. These are cards that don't actually focus on stopping your opponent's board, but just breaking it once they make the board. And this changes, depending on the format, even throughout the format, depending on what is good. And sometimes these cycle back and forth between we want to start with no hand traps. Now we actually are playing hand traps, and there's reasons to why to switch between what you're using. Now some decks will favor one option over the other, and sometimes that makes that strategy a lot more viable. Decks that are able to draw into cards on your opponent's turn are generally going to probably favor hand traps, because it's something they can draw extra resources of on the opponent's turn to use. Or if you draw a board breaker on the opponent's turn, you can really only use those on your turn most of the time, especially if it's not set on the field. So those types of decks like Pearly, Plunder Patrol, a few decks that I could think of that do draw on the opponent's turn, any deck that can make Heat Soul also draws the opponent's turn. These are decks that want to generally draw into hand traps when they are drawing, so that way they get more interruptions. A deck that's going to want to use board breakers might be a deck that doesn't have as much room for hand traps, because generally with hand traps you have to run more of them, usually 12 to 15, and some of the more kind of extreme numbers on each end is you might be able to get away with 9, depending on the deck and how high impact the cards are. And the more extreme end, when you're fitting a ton in, you could fit anywhere from 15 to 18. In decks that are very compact, you have a lot of extra room for these tech cards for hand traps. So a deck that can't fit a ton of hand traps, usually, right now the minimum is probably more towards 12 than 9. I would say with 9, you'd probably want to stick more to board breakers. But a deck that maybe only has 3 to 9 slots might want to stick to board breakers if possible, due to the fact that with hand traps, you usually have to draw multiple together. And when you have 12 hand traps in a 40 card deck, you have about a 50% chance to draw 2. It's probably more like 47 or so. And, you also have to consider sometimes hand traps of the same card, like a double Ash Blossom, you can only use one of those once per turn. So that's a 2-card hand trap combo that you don't want to draw into. So board breakers are a little bit more effective in terms of the fact that, one, you can draw into it as your 6th card and it still works. So that's really useful, making it a little bit of a higher chance of getting to your board breaker. And a lot of times you don't necessarily need multiple board breakers to break through an opponent's board. where usually 1 to 2 will do it, or with hand traps you might need 2 to 3 or 4, depending on the deck. And this will then favor which decks you're picking. Some decks are really good at playing through hand traps, some decks are really good at playing through board breakers. So depending on where the format's going, you have to make a call on which way you want to go and maybe which way you have to go. So hand traps are really good at stopping decks from getting to their board, and you might want to do this due to the fact that there's an FDK deck in the format, which is a first turn kill deck, meaning that they pretty much win the game in 1 turn. And this could be through an alternate win condition, like someone trying to draw Exodia, if that's extremely popular and powerful, which generally it's not. But if that was the case, you'd want to stop them, because breaking their board doesn't matter because they just win. Now, some decks, we could still consider them an FDK because the board they set up is so powerful you just can't break through it, generally with your engine and board breakers for most strategies. So some people consider that still kind of like a first turn kill, because even though it's not ending the game through an alternate win condition, it is still making it where it's next to impossible to beat the board if you have nothing to stop them before they get to it. It can also be good to use hand traps on decks that recur a lot of recursion when you're trying to board break them, or decks that don't necessarily commit a lot to the field, because board breakers tend to focus more on breaking the field than necessarily the graveyard or the hand or the spawn trap zones. So depending on where the deck's putting their resources to stop you, sometimes board breakers also don't work. Recursion the deck has is so strong that a board breaker still won't necessarily do it, because that deck will then kill you when they crack back on their turn. For beginner players that didn't have an understanding of card rules, now you do, and we'll kind of break through the deck and how the deck is set up. For the structure deck, you really only have 3 starters. You have Onyx, which is your main starter. Now, Onyx is a good card because it's more of a superior starter. It's a starter and can be an extender. So there are plays in which you don't necessarily have to normal summon it as your first play, depending on what combination of cards you have in your hand. Next we have Fire King Sanctuary and Fire King Island. These are more extender-based cards. They aren't going to start your plays off on their own, but in combination with multiple cards like Fire King Sanctuary and Runix is a way in which you can do the entire Fire King combo that Onyx does on its own with a 2-card combo. So there are ways in which you can combine cards together to do 2-card combos even if you don't necessarily have your starter. Next we have Tenki, just a good way to be able to search a few different cards in the deck. Allows you to get Arvada, Barong, or Ring Bali. So it's a versatile card that lets you get a card based off your need. So if you're worried about negating effects, Arvada can be a really good card. If you're worried about wanting to get some extra searches in, maybe Barong. If you want to negate spells and traps, you can go Ring Bali. So it kind of depends on your need. And one thing to consider though is that Fire Formation Tenki is not as good in formats where Droll is main decked, because especially if you're searching for a card that searches, like we'll see in the Tri-Brigade deck, if you search a card that's meant to search another card and they Droll you, that card pretty much becomes useless. So sometimes it's better in those types of formats to stick to cards to just trying to draw the card you need, versus using more and more search cards, which may make your deck more consistent, but weaker to high impact cards like Droll. Next we have Kirin, again, a really good extender, able to destroy a fire monster on the field, which is good for dodging cards that are maybe being negated. So again, like we mentioned earlier, if Onyx is summoned and they try to negate it for infinite permanence, you can then dodge it with Kirin to be able to destroy the Onyx, trigger its effect to come back during the next standby phase, summon the Kirin, be able to use the Onyx's effect to search. A really great card, and pretty much the 3 of them most of the Fire King decks. Garunix, another good extender, but not as strong. Generally needs to be paired with something else, but is really good since it could destroy a card from the deck, working really well with potentially destroying Kirin. If you need to special summon a monster from your hand or grave for extension, or really good with Barong for being able to search during the standby phase, which is a way to get Kirin to your hand on your opponent's turn. You're going to have interruption and ways to play. Again, Arvada really good at negating hand traps. So pretty useful card in combination with multiple cards. You might be able to start with an Arvada and also be able to get to a Onyx. So that way you could just do your Fire King combo, but then have a way to actually negate your opponent from hand trapping you to stop your opponent. Barong, just good searcher. Volley again, spell and trap negate. Circle the Fire King is a cool card because it can use as a additional extender to again also dodge targeting negation with the Ponyx, but also can be used for getting a lot of damage on board. But the one thing with this card is, unfortunately, unlike Kieran, you need a fire monster already in your graveyard when dodging if you're using like Ponyx, for example. It's also good for triggering your destructions, attacking, destroying that monster, summoning a new monster. This works really well for Runics, being able to trigger and summon itself from the hand or grave. So really good card for being able to OTK and put a lot of damage on board, as well as dodging cards. Rekindling, a decent card for being able to special summon a lot of monsters. Really good additional extender, and this works with a few different cards in the deck like Arvata, Burrong, and Ring Bali. So you special summon quite a few level 4s this way. Also works with Onyx, Kieran as well. So a few ways that you can really extend with this card. Unfortunately, you need quite a bit of setup for this card to be really good. Fire King Skyburn, I think a really great card for the strategy, since it allows you to actually destroy any type of card, monster, or spell and trap. So this could be great for countering a floodgate card your opponent might have. It can be a way again of avoiding targeting cards on your plays going second. Summon Ponyx, they try to negate, you destroy the Ponyx, destroy one of their cards, get your plays to go through. So very versatile card, and it's also searchable. So potentially could play more than one in the structure version. Because it's searchable, you don't necessarily need to. And then we get to our board breakers. We have Dark Hole and Dogoron. So one thing with these board breakers is they are not great going first, but Dark Hole is at least potentially playable going first. You could try to destroy your own cards to trigger their effects to summon more monsters. So I think at least it's a little bit better than Dogoron in that regard for going first. These are decent board breakers when playing, going second. So Dark Hole, great at wiping an opponent's board, and some decks are very weak to a destruction like this, but with Fire Kings being popular from a budget perspective and from a competitive perspective, as you upgrade the deck with better cards, Dark Hole is not going to be a great option because you're going to be triggering a lot of their cards. So this would definitely be one of the cards I try to swap out right away with a better card. And then we also have Dogoron the Mad Flame Kaiju, a great way of just single-handedly tributing a monster from your opponent's side of the field. So that way, if they summon a Baron, which can negate one of your cards, this can just tribute it, remove the negate, and allow you to play. Now, with the new cards coming out in Phantom Nightmare, with the Promethean Princess, that card works by destroying a fire monster on the field. So, if you were to use a kaiju, I would want to use a non-fire kaiju, because if you could remove their fire monster from the field, the Promethean Princess, won't be able to summon itself because there won't be a fire on the field. So if you are using a kaiju, I would try to use one of the ones that are not fire. Depending on what you're looking for, Gamma Seal is a really good kaiju in terms of being the lowest attack, so easiest to beat over. The Insect Kaiju also is a little bit smaller at 2400, so very cheap from the Trap Trick Structure deck, as well as the Radiant. Once you get to the 3000 Kaijus, that's where it can get a little bit harder to beat over them. The Fire King deck and Garunix being able to gain attack, you should be able to beat over most of the Kaijus, whichever you use, but I would probably stick to either using the Gamma Seal or the Kamungus, depending on what you're trying to do. Now, the Dogoron does have the synergy of working with the like Kieran or something. With the Fire King Island, it's just a monster, so that would work either way. So being a fire monster does have some synergies in the Fire King deck, but definitely post Phantom Nightmare, I would try to get like a cheaper kaiju like Kamungus if you are using kaijus, just because it will be better than giving your opponent another fire monster. And they have Torrential Tribute. The reason why I stuck for this card is because it can be good in formats where your opponent's not making a lot of negates, and it's a card that can be good going first and second. Now it's much better going first, but if your opponent doesn't make a lot of negates, you could technically set this card, let them play into it, and then blow up their board. But again, due to a lot of these, they're probably going to be a good amount of Fire King structure deck players that are playing on a budget, as well as the more competitive version that's going to be very good in February. I would try to remove this card from the deck as well, just due to how slow this card is, as well as the fact you don't generally want to be destroying your opponent's monsters. Control and Lockbird and Infinite Impermanence are your hand traps that you'll be working on for the structure deck. Now, these two come with the deck, which are great. Infinite Impermanence is one of the best hand traps in the game because it can be used first and second. So you can use this to stop your opponent's play, but if you draw it as your 6th card, you can use this to negate one of their monsters on the field to allow you to play as well. so it's a very good card. Draw Unlock Bird is a really good and a high impact card. Sometimes this alone can stop your opponent's deck, where generally an Infinite Impermanence is more of a low impact card. You need to pair this with usually multiple hand traps that are low impact to be able to stop your opponent. But with high impact cards, they tend to not be as reliable. Infinite Impermanence will almost always work. There are some decks that Draw Unlock Bird doesn't work against. So this stops decks that likes to search a lot of cards. These are generally combo decks that tend to search a lot because they need to search a lot of pieces to be able to make their board. Some of the ways to be able to play around this is if you could search during the draw phase. The decks that use quick play spells can search in the draw phase to avoid stuff, or so some decks just don't really get hurt by it, or some decks only need to search one time to be able to play. So it kind of depends on the strategy on if Troll's good, which means when you do play it in your main deck, it's kind of high risk, high reward. A lot of decks will more expect to draw in a sideboard for best 2 out of 3, but a main deck draw is something people might not expect as much. So sometimes the risk is that it could completely blow your opponent out. I guess that would be more the reward, and then the risk would be it's not playable and it's pretty much completely dead in your hand. So with these types of cards, you want to have a balance of, okay, if this isn't good in a matchup, what do I take out? All right, so in terms of extra deck, again, it's pretty slim due to the fact you're just sticking with the structure deck cards, and there are some cards you can get that are pretty cheap to start slowly upgrading your extra deck to make it quite a bit better. Okay amount of cards, probably even under $1 to a few dollars. And some cards, SP Little Knight being a very expensive card, that's I think around 120 or 130 right now. I think started its pre-sale around like 80 to 90. So there are some cards that are very expensive that you can use to upgrade and get a lot of power out of, but there's other cards like Dinkirsu that can be played in the strategy since you only need 2 level 8s that are under $1. So there are some different options you can consider to slowly start upgrading it and making your strategy better. And then when it comes to the side deck, we have Solemn Judgment, a good card to side in when going first, because you can just negate any kind of blowout card your opponent is trying to use. But again, you do have to pay half your life points, so you don't want to play this when you are close to time. Ring Bali, just another decent card that you could play if you feel like you're going into a heavier spell and trap lineup. Maybe you'll want to have an extra one of these first, maybe 3 Arvata. For board breakers, just throw a few more of the extra ones in that are only good for going second, which is Alpha and Dogoran. Again, I would swap these out for like Kamungus or something if you're looking for a cheap kaiju. Plus Phantom Nightmare. Dark Hole, again, trying to swap this out, but another good going second board breaker. Herald of the Abyss. This is another good card that comes in the deck. It's really good at countering Pearly, because it makes it where your opponent actually has to choose the card, and Pearly has a monster, their X-Pearly Noir, can be unaffected by card effects when it has 5 or more materials. This card makes it where your opponent has to send that card to the graveyard, and because they're choosing, you're not sending it. This allows you to remove the Pearly, the Noir from the field, lets you also bypass their My Friend Pearly and their Pearly Street, that let them regain resources when it's sent to the grave, because it's your opponent choosing, not you removing the card from the field. So a really good card in the structure deck for counting Pearly. It'll probably be a decent deck this format, but it does have some drawbacks. You do run into the issue of them being able to play around it if they have a quick play spell to summon their main deck Pearly monster, which is also a Dark Fairy, so it allows them to send this to the grave instead of Noir. You can also then consider other cards like XYZ Encore or Kaijus to get rid of this card, but then they each have their own plus sides and downsides to the card. Next we have a second Skyburn. Again, I think just a decent card even going first. As long as you get a Fire King on the board, you could still pop something and make plays. So it could be even a higher inclusion in the deck, and maybe even in the main deck, potentially being better than Dark Hole. I think I could see that being something, maybe play 3 Skyburn or 2 Skyburn, 1 in the side. That's something you can do. And then Onslaught the Fire King, just a decent way to get an extender on the board. I think it also can help in time, at least going second. And our time card is Fencing Fire Ferret. If this card is destroyed, sent to the grave, target a phase of monster opponent's choice, destroy it, and inflict 500 damage to your opponent. This works well with a lot of cards in the deck. Onslaught, being able to destroy it on the end phase, destroy opponent's monster, burn them, and hopefully if you don't take any damage, you can win in time. Can also be destroyed by a Garunix, Kirin, Fire King Island. Lots of ways to be able to get to this card. To destroy it gives you kind of a time option, but Fire Kings are also very good at putting a lot of damage on board with Garunix. to gain a lot of attack. Probably won't resort to this often, but it's something to keep in there as an option from the structure deck. Now, if you want to see an upgraded version, this would be the upgraded version I would use if you want to do, just a little bit of investment. I think when I checked, around last week or so, around this time, due to the rarity collection and reprints, being able to get 3 Ash Blossom, 3 Effective, and 3 Nibiru was around $18 total. These 3 cards alone will really increase your win percentage for the deck. You have 12 hand traps you can use, and so giving you around that 50% mark for being able to play. It also allows you to move Droll and Lockbird to the side. Now maybe, post Phantom Nightmare, we might be in a format where you want to main deck Droll and Lockbird. Kind of got to see how that, but in formats where generally you want a side Droll versus main, this lets you have hand traps that can all work together and stop your opponent. Lets you put Droll in the main, lets you consolidate some other cards to the side that are better. So that's definitely something to consider as a way to pretty cheaply upgrade your deck without having to go into a whole nother engine like Tri-Brigade or Dogmatika. Just these alone, which are also versatile in a lot of decks, you'll get a lot of mileage out of these being staple hand traps. So that's kind of how I'd go about upgrading the deck if you wanted to spend $20 or under for all these hand traps here. So this is going to be the deck analysis for the Dogmatika cards. So there is a few changes from these, from the initial deck run through. I wanted to make the deck a little bit more consistent, but added in Pot of Prosperities. If you ever want to find the upgraded and more recent versions of the deck, check my website. That's where I'll have an image for the deck and the cards in it that you could find there in case there are, any changes from past YouTube videos or format changes. For the Dogmatika version, you automatically get more starters than you do with the just structure deck version, which is great. Again, we went through all of the card roll stuff in the first video for the structure deck, since more of the beginner players that are starting will need to understand that. So if you're skipping around and you don't understand how card rolls work, check that section out in the first video. When it comes to starters, we have about 10 starters here. We have Ponix, Dear Servant, which can get you to Ponix, 1-for-1, which can get you to Ponix, and Pot of Prosperity, which can get you to any of these starters to be able to get to Ponix. That's pretty much the whole deck for this revolves around Ponix for this version. Now, Pot of Prosperity does have some confliction, because part of the Dear Servant aspect of the deck is sending Garua to be able to draw a card, banish it off Maximus, to be able to summon Maximus, and then Maximus can send the Shureg and the Titaniclad to be able to search Florida Lease for the Titaniclad, and for the Shureg to be able to search the Ponix since you banished the Garua. Again, that's kind of the basic idea of the combo, allowing you to get to your Ponix line. Problem with Pot of Prosperity is after you use it, you cannot draw cards by effects the turn you activate this card. So even if you Pot of Prosperity for Nadir Servant, you can still do the combo. You just can't draw off Garua. But due to the deck's lack of consistency, I think you do need to play a card like this. And luckily, due to the reprint, it's only a $3 to $4 card, where it used to be a $30 card to a $100+ card at one point. So it's significantly cheaper than it was. A lot of decks I've seen online are just generally sticking to the 7 cards as their starters, but I do think the Pot of Prosperities are a very useful way of increasing the consistency. And yes, you do lose the draw off the Garua, but it's better than not being able to play since you don't draw enough cards. Since we have more starter cards that could be really good, we can cut down on some of the extenders. So again, we don't necessarily need 3 Fire King Sanctuary, we can use 2, and 2 Fire King Island, more of an optimal ratio. Some decks might even cut this down to 1 when you get to the Sinful Spoils versions of the deck. We have 2 Tenki, just a way to kind of get to any of your cards here. Again, not as good in formats where Droll might be main decked, so you might want to focus on more of the cards you're actually trying to draw versus search. It's kind of something to consider, but a way to kind of have versatility to get any of the cards you need out of these 3 based off what you need in that situation. 3 Kieran, again, pretty standard number in most decks, just a really good extender, and probably one of the best additional extenders in the deck. Garunix, again, I think a 2 of in most decks. I think 3 gets a little cloggy, but you need it, unfortunately, with the structure deck version. 2 is nice. You can cut down to 1, but then you do risk it being banished from the graveyard and having no other way to recur it from cards like Droll and Lockbird. So I would consider probably playing 2, especially if you think Droll or other graveyard banished cards are going to be in the format. Again, we have Arvata, Effect Negate, Spell Negate, Monster Search, Brung, We have the Dogmatika cards, Dogmatika Maximus. Then you have Fleur-de-Lis, good additional extender that also can give you a negate, and also a pretty big body on the board for beating your opponent down. Again, Circle of the Fire King for targeting effect negation, kind of dodging, and then also OT King, Skyburn, being able to destroy cards your opponent controls, so dodging target effect negation going second. Then you have our hand traps here, so this is kind of the upgraded version we talked about for upgrading the structure deck, Imperm, Ash, Effect Veiler, and Nibiru. Now, in terms of upgrading, one thing you might want to consider is the playability of Ash Blossom post Phantom Nightmare, because one thing you got to consider, which is kind of crazy, is that Ash Blossom in some ways is really good next format, because the fire decks can recur Ash Blossom with Sunlight Wolf, which is a great resource to be able to have a recursable hand trap you can keep using. But due to Princess coming out in Phantom Nightmare being a really good card for fire decks, any player that is able to get 2 monsters onto the field after being Ash Blossom can go into Hita, steal your Ash Blossom, and then go into Princess to keep extending and making plays. And from there, they can go into Ambler Whale, which then gives them a target to keep making plays when you're on your turn when you special summon a monster. So Ash Blossom kind of is a really weird kind of position in the format where, again, being good because it's recursiveness, Sunlight Wolf, and generally a very solid, versatile kind of low impact hand trap, but can get really punished if they're just able to get 2 monsters on the field, which most decks can do. So kind of a weird spot here with if Ash Blossom is good. I think still played, but I think you have to be very weary about when you use it. I'd probably try to use this as more of one of my last hand traps, so they can't extend into the Hita early on. And then Effect Veiler, just good targeting effect negation, not as good as Imperm generally, but still a decent card. And pairs really well when you have a Nibiru and an Impermanence, or a Nibiru and Effect Veiler. Even if they summon a card to negate the Nibiru, you could still then negate that card to board wipe them. And I think Nibiru will be a great card next format with most decks playing into it, especially if you draw a 2-card combo with, again, Effect Veiler Nibiru, Infinite Impermanence Nibiru. For the extra deck, we start fleshing it out with newer cards, Garunix from the structure deck, but then we get a Zeus. To get a reprint in the starter deck, or the 2-player starter deck, you can easily pick this up for $20, probably lowering the price was I think like $12 to $15 before. So another way to be able to get Zeus. Almirage, a really good way to be able to link off any of your normal monsters that are under 1,000 attack into an Almirage, which is a good way to get a fire onto the field. Linkribo, another way to be able to link off Onyx, can be good in a grindy situation, because in later turns, if they ever try to negate Ponix, you can tribute it with Linkribo to get a body on the field and remove the Ponix from the field so it doesn't get negated. Hita, card again for just extending into further plays. IP Masquerena, a great way of making a disruption on the opponent's turn, also giving the monster it summons card destruction immunity. Sunlight Wolf, great recursion card for being able to recur resources like Kirin or Ash Blossom to your hand, or any other Fire King, but these will probably be the 2 cards you're trying to look for. Heat Soul, decent play that you can go into if you don't feel like you have a good line and you want to draw into hand traps. And this works well again with any 2 cybers of different attributes. You have, IP Masquerena and Almirage, 2 cybers, Linkribo and Sunlight Wolf, again 2 different cybers attribute types that you can pair together. Goddess, I really like playing Goddess as a target for IP, also a good card for outing unaffected boss monsters, and it's nice to have it in the extra deck so you don't have to draw into it. So as long as your board can summon a lot of monsters, which this deck's pretty decent at extending onto the field, can be a good card to consider playing out really annoying monsters that your opponent might play, like Pearly, Ex-Pearly Noir, or Catagnister monster, any deck that summons kind of a towers type monster that can't be affected or targeted for that. And then we kind of have our Dogmatika targets for the deck. We have Shureg, Aggregator, Long, Entis, Garua, and Titaniclad. Again, the main ones you need for the combo is Shureg, Garua, and Titaniclad. Extra cards that are nice to have are like, Aggregator, a targeted effect negation on the field. This is a targeting bounce, a targeting destruction. So other useful cards that can be really good. Now, a card that you can play in the Dogmatika deck, a good board breaker potentially, is the Ultimate Slayer. This works really well in a Dogmatika deck because this card functions off being able to have cards in your extra deck that are worth summoning that hit multiple types of cards: Fusion, Synchro, Exceed, Pendulum, and Link. Pretty much good against any card. if you have the cards to be able to benefit from it. Now, if you were to play this card, I would try to probably fit a Tri-Brigade Bucephalus II into the deck. It is very helpful for being able to send Garua and give you a link target. So that's something I would make sure I would add. You could probably for that, maybe you cut Zeus because you might not go into it that much. So there are some different options. I'd probably cut Goddess for the Bucephalus especially if I were to go for the Ultimate Slayer route. But a really good card that allows you to be able to remove an opponent's monster on the field, and they can't respond with monster effects. So a good way to out different cards. I don't know how great it's going to be post Phantom Nightmare, but I still think worst case situation, if you can out a Link monster, you'll get to remove that monster from the field and draw a card. So I don't think it's going to be bad. A lot of boards are going to try to end on an Appaloosa. Appaloosa will, be sent to the extra deck. They can't negate it, and you get to draw an extra card. So you're still going to plus in that situation. So not a bad card to consider playing. And if I were to cut anything from the deck, when it comes to that, I would probably consider putting this in the side deck and maybe cut the Dogorons. If you really want to keep the Kaijus, I'd probably consider cutting the maybe Talents in like one Dogoron. So that's another card to consider playing. And then for the side deck, Droll Knockbird, Stopping Searching, DD Crow, a good way to be able to hit multiple decks in the format. It's good against Unchained, Pearly, Fire King, Snake Eye decks. Being able to remove your opponent's cards from play is very strong. Dogoron, again, just a good way just to remove any threat your opponent has. But I would probably still stick to using like Kamungus, the Insect Kaiju, if you want to use a Kaiju, because again, post Phantom Nightmare, don't want to be giving them a fire monster with Princess. And then Cosmic Cyclone, really good versus a lot of strategies, even going first and second. Good against Fire King. You can hit the island to blow up their field, the Sanctuary, so they can't do the Exceed Summon on your turn to blow up your field. You can hit the Pearly Happiness, so they can't search. Get rid of Street, so you can target them for Pearly. You can banish Labyrinth cards, so they can't use the graveyard effect of Big Welcome Labyrinth. You can, the card they set off Sinful Spoils when you're using the Black Witch. So there's different ways you can use this to really hurt your opponent. And a really good card that we'll probably see in most decks next format, post Phantom Nightmare. Talent's just a generically good going first or going second card. I think this also makes Zeus more viable in the extra if you are playing Talent. So if you cut this, maybe you consider just cutting Zeus potentially as well, because you can still use it with the Grunix. A lot of times you want to pop the Grunix versus putting it underneath the Zeus. So it kind of depends, but a generically good card to let you look at your opponent's hand. If they hand trap you, play going second by stealing a monster. Really good generic card. And then we have Call by the Grave, just a way to be able to negate a Droll, to be able to negate a Shifter. Cards that will really hurt you going first and second. And is also decent in matchups against Fire King going second, because during the draw phase you can banish the Ponyx, so theirs doesn't trigger, or the Kieran, or Barong, so theirs doesn't trigger. I'd probably banish the Barong in a mirror match, because banishing the Ponyx turns off your deck as well, where you can probably get by if not needing the Barong. Okay, so that covers kind of the deck analysis for the Nadir Servant version. Again, the big thing I've seen is that a lot of decks look very similar to this online, but I think the Pot of Prosperity is a much needed inclusion for consistency for this version. Right, so next we will move on to the Tri-Brigade budget version of the deck. So I think this is the best version of the budget versions of Tri-Brigade, and I think even better than the Sinful Spoils version right now when it comes to the deck. Post Phantom Nightmare, the Sinful Spoils version is going to be much better. So you have Bonfire, Populace, Sinful Spoils wanted cards. There's going to be so much consistency and so many good cards to add. I do think this deck will struggle in comparison to that. Maybe there's a way you could play a very small Fire King engine with the Sinful Spoils as well. I think that is something you could consider. When it comes to this deck, in terms of starters, we have Ponyx, 1-for-1 to get to Ponyx, Tenki, which can get to Fractal, Kit, which as a normal summon can start its plays, and also combos really well with Kieran and Fire King Island, and then Nerval, another way to kind of start plays by normal summoning it. That's all being able to use All Mirage to be able to remove these monsters from the fields. They go to the grave. Tri-Brigade deck, again, is Tenki if we go into a Droll format where people are main decking Droll, because Tenki into Fractal, you get completely shut down. And most of the Fire King decks lose to Droll. I think the deck's going to struggle with Droll, especially the Tri-Brigade version, because you do a lot of searching, and there's not really ways to do that during the draw phase. So I think it's going to be a weakness of this deck. So maybe it's a reason to play 3 Fractal, get 1 Tenki, with the versatility of getting Arvata or Barong. but better chance of just opening the fractal versus trying to search it. And then you have Kit, really good card in the deck since it could be destroyed off Garunix from deck to trigger. Again, Sanctuary and Fire King Island, good extender cards to be able to get to your lines, but not enough just on their own to start your plays. Kiraz, I think the Tri-Brigade numbers can vary depending on what you're trying to play. Some people might want to play 2 and 3 of this. I think it really just depends on what you're looking for and how slim you want to make Tri-Brigade engine. But I think you could probably get by with 1. Maybe play 2 if that's something you're looking for. Maybe you just play 2 Kiraz, 3 Fractal, cut the Tenki. That I think could also be a consideration. Next you have 3 Kieran, again, really great target, stop your opponent from being able to target, your Ponyx on summon or your fire monsters that are activating on the field. Also a way to extend. Runix, a way to extend, put a lot of damage on board. Marvata is the effect negation. Barong is the monster search. Circle, again, can dodge targeting negation if you have a fire engrave, as well as be able to extend and put a lot of damage on board for OTKs. Great way to kind of help OTK and destroy your opponent's field. Also, it's searchable, good against floodgates. Really good card. I think most decks should still consider playing. Then again, we have our hand trap lineup. Infinite Impermanence, Ash, Red Flare, Nibiru. Great combination of low to medium impact hand traps. With Nibiru being probably medium impact. Can sometimes do enough on its own, but generally needs to be paired with another card to be able to stop your opponent. And then we have the One Revolt, for being able to do your Tri-Brigade lines. Now, I do like the Tri-Brigade version of the deck because, one, it has multiple lines to kind of go through. It's more consistent. Both versions of the deck access each other, which is nice that the Dogmatika deck doesn't do. You could start with Fire King and get to your Tri-Brigade combos, and you could start with Tri-Brigade and get to your Fire King cards. So some really cool ways to be able to do that. The Tri-Brigade cards are able to get to the Fire King by linking away the Shureg into his Atlantis. You could also link into a second Verigite if you don't have Atlantis. It's another option to consider. But a good way to send Shureg, because you have banished Beast Wing Beasts or Beast Warriors, you can then search the Ponyx and start those lines as well. So some really cool ways that the engine can actually access each other, and then Garunix can pop the kit from deck to get to your Tri-Brigade lines. And we'll show all these in combos in the next section of this Tri-Brigade, Fire King combo part of the video. Extra deck wise, still some similarities to a lot of the extra deck outside of the extra Beast Warrior cards. So Garunix for the, summon on your opponent's turn to board wipe them. Salamangreat Almirage, really great and really required in the deck when it comes to using the Tri-Brigade cards. And a good way to just get a fire on board. Hita, a good way to steal your opponent's cards to Link Climb. IP and Unicorn. Again, this is a budget version for the deck, so you could definitely change Unicorn for SP, a much better card, but significantly more expensive. Next, we kind of go into the Tri-Brigade Beast Warrior monsters. The Tri-Brigade cards can cheat out. I like Scareclaw Lightheart as a way to be able to banish one monster from the grave, to be able to then Link Climb into your other cards like Ferret, Bear Room. So I think it's a useful card to play, but not necessarily mandatory. If you want to play another card for utility, you can definitely do that. Double Dragon Lord, a really great way to non-destruction, remove a monster from the field. Works well with Tenki in the deck and your other face-up cards. So very solid card. Doom Eagle, another really good way to remove monsters from your opponent's graveyard. I really like this card in the deck as well in the format. You can be able to remove your Ponyx, Garunix, different Promethean Princess, different cards. You can send them back so that way they can't trigger it in the grave. Appaloosa, really good end board option for the deck to be able to get some monster effect negations on board. I would never probably summon this now with 4 materials. I'd probably always summon it with 3 or less. You'll probably want to do 3 to 2, or 3 being 2400 attack points. A little bit harder to beat over. 1600, still decent, so some deck cards can't just run over it, but we'll give you at least 2 effect negations. So a good way to kind of link off Bear Broom, search a Revolt, have a monster on field that can negate something. Then we have our main Tri-Brigade links. I think you could try to fit in a second Ferret by maybe cutting a Goddess if you don't feel you need that, or maybe the Lightheart. I do think this would be the one I would play 2 of if I were to want to. You could also play 2 of this instead of Atlantis. So you could still do the Fire King line as long as you have 2 monsters on the field instead of just linking the Shureg into as Atlantis, you could link the Shureg and another monster into a second Ferret as another option. Now, Ferret's also nice because it allows you to extend. So if you start with your Tri-Brigade cards, you go into Ferret, and you have Ponics in hand, you can special summon the Ponics. It's a really good card. You can sculpt your hand, put back cards you don't want. Bear Broom can also extend by bringing one of your banished Beast Warriors back. They're level 4 or lower, but it does take 2 cards as a discard, and this is all part of the cost in discarding and then targeting as the condition part of the cost. This is a pretty hefty cost to play and will probably deplete most of your hand, but does give you some extension plays, but most of the time it's used just to link it off to search the Revolt. So you have that as a banishing interruption with Shureg. Zealantis is a really cool card, works by being able to send the Shureg since it's a link 4, and this is a link 4 and it says 1+ effect monster, so you can send any link 4 to the grave with summon Zealantis. Great way to do some OTKs, banish cards from the field. A really cool card for the deck and very cheap, so you'll be able to pick these up for under $1. We have our second Shureg. I think for grind game potential this is very important. And then Goddess for just removing any non-targeting tower-based monsters your opponent controls. Side deck, we have the Control Unlock Birds. Again, could potentially be moved to the main depending on the format. I think DD Crow, very solid card in the format. We also have Dogoran, the Mad Flame Kaiju, and we've kind of talked about maybe swapping this for a Kamungus. Cosmic Cyclone, really good at banishing your opponent's cards. Attacks talents, a very good just generic going first and second card. Look at your opponent's hand. If they hand trap you to steal a card, draw into more cards to keep playing. Steal an opponent's monster going second. And then, Called by the Grave, negating Drone Lockbird and Shifter. Very helpful for that. Something to maybe consider, especially for this deck. One, you do a lot of banishing. You might want to watch out for Artifact Lancia. This is a card that might get more popular because, one, it's a good counter card during your opponent's turn. So if they Lancia you, you can't banish any of the Tri-Brigade cards from the grave for effect. So that could be something to consider as maybe a weakness to the Tri-Brigade version of the deck. But this can also be used as going first, that when you're playing and your opponent goes second, if they try to Cosmic you, they can't negate any of your cards. If they try to Soul Release to banish your cards, Lancia so they can't Soul Negate, Soul Release. You can also play Bell. This is a way of stopping your graveyard special summoning. Promethea Princess, Runix. You can also use this to counter your opponent banishing cards from your graveyard with Soul Release or DD Crow. So very useful card that I think we could also see in the side or potentially main deck as well. Keep them out for Artifact Lancia or Bell as different options. I'd probably use Bell in this deck versus Lancia, because if you Lancia your opponent during their turn, using Revolt won't allow you to banish off the Shureg summon. So I think Lancia will hurt you more than help you in the Tri-Brigade deck. I think Bell would be a very good card for countering your opponent's strategies, but also protecting you from potential cards as well. But without Lancia, you are weaker to Cosmic. Just some things to consider for the Tri-Brigade deck. Also, maybe consider what maybe you want the Dogoran to be for the Kaiju slot. Maybe it's Herald of the Abyss to hard counter Pearly. Maybe it's Dogoran as a way to counter Pearly, but also more generic cards like Baron or other options. Or maybe it's XYZ Encore, so targeting Exceed monsters, remove the materials off of Zeus. You can remove the materials off of a Abyss Dweller, Pearly Noir. So some different options depending on what you want to consider playing around and what's a problem for you. So again, I think Abyss Dweller is going to be a really big problem for this deck for both engines. So I would consider wanting to get XYZ Encore if you can afford the card. I think still pretty expensive right now, like 15 a copy. So you can look for more budget alternatives like the Kaijus or the Herald of the Abyss that comes with the deck. So that pretty much covers the deck analysis for the Tri-Brigade version. Again, I think the most consistent of the budget versions of the deck, and probably the best version of the deck pre-Phantom Knight. So next we have the Sinful Spoils version of the deck. This might be something you want to play if you are like money just for bonfires and populace. Maybe you already have the Sinful Spoils version of the cards from playing Rescue Ace, but don't have the money for the other options. To keep upgrading the deck, something to consider. One thing I would maybe try to do with this deck is maybe even play more of the Sinful Spoils. Right now we have 8 starter cards, this version of the deck. Maybe you play 3 Witch, maybe multiple of the Sinful Spoils to just get to Ponics. It's definitely something to consider. Maybe you cut the Tenkis and the Arvatas down. One thing I like with this version of the deck is opening Wanted and Arvata is a pretty nice combo, because you could be able to play through hand traps by having the Arvata for the negate. So it's one version I like about this deck over the others. Be able to open Arvata and another starter. So I think that could be a nice combo for the deck to have. You could play 1-for-1, but the deck already loses hand advantage with the Black Witch as well. Could be kind of risky, but another starter you could play. Then we have, 2 Sanctuary, 2 Fire King Island, pretty standard for the deck. Tenki for searching out your, different options. Arvata, Burrow, and Rangbali. Monster Negate, Monster Search, Spell Negate. But again, in Droll formats, you might want to consider cutting this from more of the cards you want. But I think in this deck, you kind of got to take the Tenki search, since a lot of times you want to get Arvata. So it just gives you more copies of this. Then again, Kirin, best additional extender in the deck, stops the targeting negation on Onyx or other fire monsters, as well as, since it destroys some monsters in the field, as well as being able to special summon a body onto the field and extend when it's destroyed. So really good card. Runix, really good additional extender. Not as good as Kirin, so you definitely can cut this down. Maybe even play 2 or play 1. But again, if you're seeing a lot of banishment cards from the graveyard, like DD Crow, I think you might want to play 2 just for the safety of your engine, so you don't just lose it and have no way to access it. Arvata, I think a big strength of this deck, again, being able to start with like Wanted and Arvata feels really good. Have our other additional extenders here, can be destroyed to special summon other monsters, but again have their mostly for their effect. I can see getting rid of Rangbali. I like it as a utility option since it's searchable in a 1-of for more spawn trap based matchups. But if you find this not being useful, you could definitely play this for other options. You can play Snake Eye Ash in this deck and play even a higher count, and we'll definitely be playing a higher count if you're playing the Populace, because the deck will like heavily rely on Populace for that version of the deck. But another option you can play if you like open Onyx Wanted, really good card, good additional extender, works well with the Flamebird's Dragon as well. So again, you could consider increasing the Snake Eye to try to add more consistency with more 2-card combos to the deck. Circle the Fire King, again, just good way to target, stop targeting effect negation going second and put a lot of damage on board. Didn't really cover the Flamebird's Dragon. A really nice way to be able to use Snake Eye Ash to summon this from deck. This has a really nice way to be able to recur monsters like Onyx and Ash to get more searches on your opponent's turn, as well as the ability to summon a monster from the spawn trap zone. Quick effect works really well with IP to be able to summon into like an SP on the opponent's turn. So really good card in the deck. Was very cheap on release, a couple bucks. Now it's gone up in price. Skyburn, a targeting destruction card that you can use with the Fire Kings. Really good going second to make big pushes, destroy your opponent's cards, can out floodgates. I think really useful card in the deck. Really nice for different decks to have this type of card in their strategy. Then we have, our standard kind of hand trap lineup right now. Triple Infinite Permanence, triple Ash, triple Effect Veiler, and Nibiru. Again, I've talked about why Ash is kind of problematic, but pretty much the gist of it is with Promethean Princess, Ash becomes a questionable card because any 2 monsters can make Hita, seal the Ash from the opponent, go into Princess, keep making bigger plays. So something to consider if you want to play Ash or when to play Ash in terms of sequencing your hand traps. Again, this lineup works really well with, I think, Nib being really good, so even decks that can get to a negate, like Baron to floor, you can use Infinite Permanence or Effect Veiler with the Nibiru to negate that and board wipe them. Extra deck wise, I think is pretty standard for this list. Garunix, getting really good in the deck. Typhon, I think a really good card going second. I think most decks should play it, just an extra way to push through your opponent's field. Zeus, I think works well with this deck, having the multiple level 1s for Slacker Magician, Downer Magician into Zeus. Can also go Dingirsu with 2 level 8s. It has also, destruction protection, as well as a non-targeting send. So it doesn't trigger the Fire Kings. It's really good, and also can attack and then go into Zeus as well. So I think Zeus and this package is nice in the deck. Almirage, again, a way of removing those 8,000 or less attack from the field. Link Karibo is removing level 1. Again, these work well with combining with Deco Talker Heat Soul line, Almirage and IP into Heat Soul, Fire and Dark Cybers, or Link Karibo and Sunlight Wolf into Dark Fire combo for Heat Soul. The Sunlight Wolf recurs Kirin, can recur Ash, part of the benefit of playing Ash. I think you could definitely cut this if you don't want to play it without the Princess, but I do think the deck has ways to utilize this card pretty well even without Princess being out, and could be considered as a card to play. Then Heat Soul, just a line you could use to draw into more hand traps. Underworld Goddess can out non-targeting monsters, also decent play with IP in the deck as well. And then for the side deck we have Troll and Lockbird, DD Crow, XYZ Encore, Cosmic Cyclones, Talents, and Called by the Grave. I think these are pretty standard options to be able to play for the side deck. Again, Troll and Lockbird, I think really good against Fire King. If they open Snake Eye Ash post Phantom Nightmare, they could still play through the Drone Lockbird, but they start with like a card like Wanted, Onyx. That's going to make the deck a lot weaker. If they do have ways to start with the Ash or ways to special summon it, that's a lot better into Droll. So I think this version of the deck has ways to play through Droll, especially for post Phantom Nightmare, but still a very solid card in the form. DD Crow, again, just really good at targeting effect negation and works well against a lot of different matchups. Pearly, Unchained, we'll see how viable that is post Phantom Nightmare. Good against Fire King, so very solid low impact hand trap. XYZ Encore, again, a way to out Pearly with E-Pearly Noir and being able to out Abyss Dweller. So I like this card as an option. Cosmic Cyclone, again, a really good card for Pearly, Chained, Labyrinth, Fire King, the Snake Eye deck. You can hit the original when they set it. So some really good ways to be able to use this card first and second. Helm's just generic. Again, going first, going second card. They hand trap you. You look at a card in their hand, remove one of their starters or board breakers, or another hand trap you don't want to play through. Draw more cards if you need to keep playing, get steal your opponent's cards. Overall good, solid card, especially in heavily hand trap formats, which we're going into. And then we have Called by the Grave, really good for negating Drone Lockbird, Shifter, cards that can really shut down the deck. If you do want to know about some more specialized tech side deck cards you can consider playing, I'll go through those at the end of the video once we get through all the different decks. Make sure to stick to the end to see some cards you can consider playing. Again, this will kind of more depend on the read of the format and what people are playing, because some of these are more counter picks, but very helpful cards. Stick to the end to kind of check that out. And then next we'll go over the Fire King Snake Eye post Phantom Nightmare deck. So again, kind of looking at the card rules in the deck, we have 3 Ash, 3 Bonfire, 3 Wanted, 1 of the Witch, and 1 of the Angel's Sinful Spoils, and then Onyx. So in terms of starters for this version of the deck, we have 3, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 potential starters. Now the ideal starter for this deck is Ash. You don't actually really want to start with Onyx, and some of these decks are actually not running Barong. I do like running Barong as a utility for it, but you can definitely cut this still. I just like that it still makes Onyx a 1-card play, and I think still can have some utility as a 1-of, but you can definitely cut this, and that would make Onyx no longer starter. So that might be maybe play an extra Witch as an option, maybe you play an extra Snake Eye Sinful Spoils card. So definitely stuff to consider when it comes to what you want to play in terms of the starter cards you want to use based off maybe how you're altering the deck. Another couple things to consider is maybe playing 1 of the Sanctuary. Again, there's so many ways to access Onyx. You don't necessarily want to draw this. One thing to consider is if Cosmic's very popular, maybe you do want to play more than once, you don't lose your only access to it. Same with Fire King Island. This card, again, if it gets Cosmic'd, you really want to have a second copy, and I think if you were to ever cut these down to 1, you would only cut the Sanctuary to 1 and keep 2 of the Fire King Island. You have the 3 Kieran, again, very standard in most builds. Stop your opponent from using target effect negation on one of your fire monsters, as well as extra bodies on field and extension. Again, Garunix, a lot of people are cutting this to 1 as well. I think this will be a read on a lot of people playing, graveyard banishment cards like Called by, DD Crow, and some other ones we could use Soul Release, different options. You might want to keep a second one of these as a way to be able to grind better in a longer game once resources are banished. But again, can cut down for 1 for efficiency. So that's kind of your trade-off. More resilient in a grind game, better efficiency in terms of not drawing this card. And then you have Populace, I think generally just a 2 of, so if you do draw 1, you could search the other. And then, we have our kind of 1 of cards you can get for utility, Arvata for a monster negate, as well as, being extend out when it's destroyed. And then also Barong, again, a cuttable card if you don't want Onyx to be a starter, and definitely one of the cards I'd consider cutting if you want to cut something. Then with the Flamebird's Dragon, works great with the Ash, has really cool lines with IP, being able to summon IP from the Spell and Trap Zone to go to SP on the opponent's turn. Really great extension when it's linked off to be able to bring back cards like Ash, Onyx, or Ash and Populace, so you can search other cards and get a lot of follow-up. So really great card in the deck for follow-up and grind game. Skyburn is something I don't see a lot of people play, but again, I still think it's nice, especially to out Floodgate cards in the deck. So I think it can be a really useful card to still keep as a 1-of. And then we have our standard hand trap lineup again: Infinite Permanence, Ash Blossom, Effect Veiler, Nibiru. And again, these work really well with some decks putting out, Baron before the 5th summon, or Savage Dragon for the negation. So again, being able to pair infinite permanence and effect veiler with Nibiru, it's a great way to build out your opponent's boards here. And then 12 hand traps, so about 47% chance to open up 2 going second. And a lot of these are decent in multiples with effect veiler and infinite permanence not being once per turn, so it does help with this lineup. And then for the extra deck, you have the 1 Garunix for the board wipe, 1 Typhon, just a great card for going second. I think most decks should be playing this if you don't lock yourself out of being able to summon this card. Zeus, also a very good card for going second. The Slacker, Magician, and Downard line for being able to make a 4 material Zeus for a double board wipe. You know, the Ponix and Ash, or Ponix, Populous, Ash, and Populous. I think a really good line for this to utilize. All Mirage, Link Karibo, kind of IP, and Sunlight Wolf all kind of work as really great attributes for the Deco Talker. Heat Soul, again, just a way to link off a monster for another fire on the field. Link Karibo is a great card for, you know, to link off any of your level 1s, as well as a way to recur it back to the field as well, which is nice. It can be recurred back to be able to like hit a Sunlight Wolf arrow, so you could add a fire back to hand like Kieran or Ash. IP works really well with the Flamebridge Dragon as well as going to SP, so a really great card in the deck and has a lot of recursion, and giving your cards target destruction immunity is also nice. Sunlight Wolf, again, good recursion for Ash or Kieran, but you know, also just a useful attribute for making Heat Soul. This one, Promethean Princess, just an amazing card post Phantom Nightmare. I am scared to see the price tags on some of these OCG cards. You know, we already know Bonfire is currently out in the TCG right now. I just haven't updated my database for Edo Pro, but this card is like $90 to like $110 depending on where pre-sales are kind of at, and now the card's more officially released, so hopefully it goes down a little at least, but very expensive. This will probably also be expensive as well as Populous, so the price of this deck is going to be quite a bit. And then we also have, you know, the Heat Soul line, nice line to be able to rely on to draw some extra cards. I could see potentially being cut from the deck as well, and it's like another option to consider. Ambler Whale works really well with the Princess, so also a very good card. And then we have the Goddess. Again, I like having Goddess as an option in the deck, works well with IP and out untargetable monsters, but definitely something to consider. Another option to maybe consider adding to the deck is Pit Knight. Way to kind of play if you get Nibiru'd with having a fire on board for Princess, and does have a way to negate and reduce the monster's attack to 0. Can be useful on the opponent's turn when you summon a monster to its own. If I were to probably cut this, I'd maybe cut Goddess for this card. That's probably what I'd consider cutting. If you're going to maybe even Heat Soul if you just don't want to go into it, because the other cards are still like, useful even without Heat Soul to go into. So stuff I would consider playing for the Pit Knight. And then side deck, Dual Knockbirds, again really good searching this format, but again if your opponent starts with Ash, they can play through Droll pretty well still. DD Crow, good for banish cards in the grave, versatile card in a lot of matchups. Pearly, Unchained, Fire King, very solid card overall. Cosmic Cyclone, again really good against Fire King, Labyrinth, Shurion, very good card this format. Runic decks. Then we have Voltax Talent, really good card when it comes to being able to play first and second. And since both Phantom Nightmare, we're going to be in probably a very heavy hand trap format. Again, just cards like this really shine when your opponent hand traps. You could rip the second hand trap, rip the starter, the board breaker if they are playing board breakers. You know, draw into more cards if your hand's not very good. Keep playing, you know, steal your opponent's monster. Very solid, especially when running Zeus in the deck. XYZ Encore's way of outing Exceed monsters like Abyss Dweller, Pearly Noir, Zeus. Very solid card. And then the Called by the Grave to be able to outdraw out the Dimension Shifter. So very good card as well. So what I'm going to do is I'll load up some of the extra tech cards you can consider playing in the side deck. You can see what those are, and we'll kind of talk about those as options to consider as well. So these are kind of the tech cards we're going to be kind of looking at in packages you could play. I think interesting cards to play in the side deck. I think we can maybe say Bell as a main deck card, but I like kind of Crow better for its versatility in the main deck. But this is, I think, a really good card in the side because you can counter side your opponent with this. So it stops the Fire King cards that we talked about, versions we're looking at. You know, you can stop any card that specifies from the grave. Princess, Fire King Grunix, really great card for that. But the other thing it's really good at is it could stop cards from banishing from grave. Like, so if your opponent tries to DD Crow you, if they try to soul release you, which is a huge going format, probably one of the few board breakers you really want to play. since most of the Fire King Snake Eye decks, or pure Snake Eye decks, even Rescue Eye Snake Eye decks, a lot of these resources in the grave. Rescue still have stuff on the field too. The Snake Eye and Fire King Snake Eye decks, mostly everybody's going to be in the grave, so it's a great way to really out their board. Pretty much leaves them with a Flame Verge and a IP on board. Bell is a great way to counter Soul Release since they can't banish cards from the grave. Lancia can also negate Soul Release as an option. It also stops cards like Cosmic Cyclone, and it can stop cards like Evenly Match, which I don't think is going to be good next format, but just again can stop those blowout cards, and can be a really good card to counter siding going first, so your opponent can't banish your field or grave. So these are, I think, 2 counter side cards you can play. Another really good package going second is Shaddoll Fusion. Really good card for going second, since you can break your opponent's board with cards like this, which is nice. You know, some targets you can consider is Beast for a draw, Shaddoll Dragon for a spell and trap pop, Nell Shaddoll Aerial, banishing 3 from your opponent's grave, Shaddoll Krista as a fire target to be able to summon, send one of your fire monsters to the grave, a Shaddoll monster. So it kind of depends. You can also go App Cologne to be able to force a negate on the Appaloosa if you turn send 2 Shaddolls from the grave instead of just sending one of your Shaddolls in a fire. So some really great uses for the card. This is great for banishing resources. You do, by summoning the Krista or the App Cologne, which are probably the ones you would summon, you do trigger the opponent's princess, but they kind of have to trigger it, because otherwise you banish it with Aerial. So it forces that out at maybe an unopportune time. And then if they do destroy like your Krista or App Cologne, you get the Shaddoll Fusion back to your hand, so it's also very nice. So definitely some really cool things to consider with this package. That's really good, especially going second, but it does take up some space, so it's something you gotta consider. Then you also have Monster Reborn, a really good card, especially in mirror match situations. Being able to steal your opponent's cards like Ponix or Snake Eye Ash to plays. You can also steal your opponent's Promethean Princess, so that way they can't trigger it on your turn, and then use it as an extender as you play through your cards as well, only getting rid of it when you can stop the effect from triggering in the grave, or maybe you find a way to remove it from the field. Equip it in the small trap zone. So really cool ways to be able to use this card. If they stop, let's say they imperm your Snake Eye Ash, if you can get this to the grave, you can then Monster Reborn it back, use the effect, the Link Karibo you linked it off with, or the Almarosh you linked it off with, to be able to then get the Flamebird Dragon out. So there's some cool ways you can extend even without stealing your opponent's monsters. And this deck is going to be able to benefit off having these really strong extenders, especially in mirror matches, which I think this deck is going to be very popular in a lot of mirror matches. So Monster Reborn could be really good. We talked about Soul Release as a way to just banish a ton of cards from your opponent's grave, stopping what they can. We also have another card that we can put into this as well, but this only works with Fiend decks. So this can be a card that you can maybe see playing in Thunder Patrol, Dark World, Unchained. Probably Unchained being the most viable of the decks kind of mentioned that are using Fiends. Also Labyrinth could play this as well as an option for a quick play banish 3. So not as good as Soul Release, better timing than Soul Release, than the Nell Shaddoll Aerial. So very cool card. But we'll talk about kind of these here for banishing graveyard effects. So we have first Made to Order Mermaid or Outfitter. So this is a target 1 card in your opponent's grave, banish it. Bare minimum effect, just remove a card from your opponent's grave, but it is a normal spell, so spell speed 1. If your opponent is triggering cards like Ponix or Barone in the standby phase, this is going to be too late. One of the nice things about this is you can add 1 card from your deck to your hand with the name as the banished card. So this can be great if you're trying to get a hand trap from your opponent's field. If they use the hand trap on you, you could search it as well. Since hand traps are probably going to be things that a lot of decks have overlap in, even in non-mirror matches. But in mirror matches, you could steal your opponent's Snake Eye Ash, you could steal you can banish their princess just so it's not in the grave, steal their Populace to then set your spawn trap card for wanted. You can take a lot of different cards from your opponent's graveyard. You remove the Flamebirds so they don't have theirs in grave anymore, get the Garunix banished, and then get yours out. A lot of really interesting uses, could potentially see some play, but it is only a banish 1, but does have the benefit of being a board breaker kind of starter card as well, which is kind of interesting, similar to a Nadir Servant situation. So I could see this card maybe seeing some play, especially if you're expecting a lot of mirror matches. And then Dark World Puppetry, kind of talked about this card briefly, similar to a Soul Release type of card, but you have to discard, you banish 3 cards from your opponent's graveyard and it's a target. but you can target 3, banish them, discard 1 fiend. Cool thing with this is if you only need 2 to target, like in a Fire King situation, and it's maybe more pure or not the Snake Eye version, you can banish both Ponix and Barong in the draw phase, so they don't trigger. Both of those are gone, and if you do banish one of your fiends that may be in the grave at this point, you can then recur this card on the next turn, which can be nice for certain strategies. So it's a way to consider to get some of your banished fiends back as well. So this can also add some extension, which is nice. But again, just a quick play banish card that could be really good, and hitting 3 of their main resources. I think in some sense Soul Release is better because of being able to target so many cards. You can get rid of the Ash, the Ponix, they can get rid of Oak if they're playing the Snake Eye Oak card as well. In like a pure Snake Eye deck, you can get rid of the Flameburst Dragon, so they don't get that. You can get rid of the Princess, the Garunix. There are quite a few targets you want to get rid of, and I'm not sure if 3 is enough, especially post Phantom Nightmare, where the Soul Release might be what you want to play. But again, this doesn't necessarily play around the standard Fire King combo with the Ponix Barong line. So there's going to be some trade-offs depending on which you're using. This is much better versus the Snake Eye version that's not really relying on the Ponix kind of exceed somehow on your opponent's turn play, but this is very good against that. So again, here's some special tech cards that you can consider playing post Phantom Nightmare, either in mirror matches or to really help counter those decks. Right, so I hope this is really helpful for the deck analysis, just trying to explain how the decks are constructed, theory behind the amount of card rules you're playing, how those work, different tech options, and kind of the synergies for why the cards are in the deck, and things you can swap things out for, and how to think about which cards are good depending on the situation, and why you might alter your deck building based off what you're considering to expect in the format. Again, just remember, deck building isn't necessarily going to be a perfect solution. There could be reasons, again, to play 2 of a card or 1 of a card, and they're going to have their trade-offs. And a lot of that is really making reads on what you think is being played and what you're trying to play around. And that is part of a step for becoming a really good player and getting better at deck building, is being able to make those decisions. Again, I hope this was really helpful. If it was, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help. Especially making these longer videos means a lot, and it's nice to see people are liking the content. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And if you want to join and become a patron to support the channel because you like the content I'm making, you can find the links in my video description about page on my YouTube channel or my website. You can see different things that will come with each of the tiers, as well as each tier having a 7-day free trial to try it out and see if you like it before committing financially. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you guys in future videos.